Hello again. So training zones, we all use training zones, but do they really matter? Well, if you just have a quick look at Training Peaks, you can see there are loads of different training zones. So we've got heart rate zones. You can choose whether to use lactate threshold, maximum heart rate, resting heart rate, and then you've got all these different methods to use. And then, of course, you've got the same thing for power, and then you've got the same thing for a pace if you're a runner. So, I mean, does it matter which ones you choose? Well, I don't think it really matters what you use, actually. But training zones are just some sort of fairly arbitrary way of splitting how intensely you're training. And how you do that doesn't really matter as long as you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it in a certain way. I think it is important to have a rough idea of your lactate threshold, your FTP, your critical pace, critical power, because that's a reasonably important physiological marker. If you go above that, then you're sort of into your anaerobic zone, you're going to be using your anaerobic capacity. The other good thing about your FTP, your lactate threshold, is that it's fairly easy to measure. Without lab equipment, you can go out and do a 30-minute time trial, or you can use the WKO power duration curve, or use an estimate from Strava or whatever, and you'll get an idea of what that is. So I quite like to use that to set the training zones that I use. I mean, I do use training zones, but I don't really worry too much about which training zones I'm using. I tend to use whatever the athlete that I'm coaching has set up in Training Peaks if they're comfortable with those zones, and if they're not, I tend to use the Coggan zones. I quite like the Coggan zones because they're fairly simple. There's only 5 basic zones, and then you've got the power zones, the anaerobic zones, and after the FTP, then I tend to be very specific about what powers to use, so I don't worry too much about zones above FTP. So really you've got zone 1, which is recovery, zone 2, which is endurance, 3 sort of tempo, 4 threshold around your FTP, and then above that. And that's the sort of zones that I have in my head. And if somebody's using different zones, then I just sort of have a feel for how they work within those basic levels. The way I tend to work is I set training sessions based on power or heart rate if people don't have a power meter. But then I review the training sessions by using the heart rate zones that are set in Training Peaks. And the reason I do that isn't really because I'm looking for how much time somebody spent in a given zone. It's just to get a feel for how much time they spent at a lowish intensity or high intensity above their FTP and things like that. So I quite like this chart in Training Peaks, and the dotted line shows the lactate threshold heart rate. And what I like about the zones is that they show bands, so you can look at the heart rate trace and see how it fluctuates, whether it rises steadily, whether it stays at a certain level or drifts or all these other things. And I don't worry too much about what zone people are in. I just look at the sort of trends and how the heart rate's behaving. And I see how it's behaving relative to that lactate threshold heart rate. So particularly if I was looking at an interval session and I say it was supposed to be a threshold session, an FTP type session, then I'd see whether the heart rate was drifting. Let's say it might be 4 by 8 minutes. You'd expect the first 8-minute effort to be a bit below lactate threshold, and then the second and the third ones to be either approaching it or a little bit above, and the last one might be a little bit above at the end of the effort. And that would, to me, would say that it was a good session, and the power targets were set well, and on that day the athlete was well rested and ready to perform. So that's how I used the heart rate zones. In terms of power zones, I don't really use power zones very much at all. I tend to set an upper limit for longer rides and say you stay below 200 watts or something like that. And then I say, well, you should feel like say it's an endurance ride, you should feel like you could have a conversation, perceived exertion 2 to 4 or something like that. And then let the athlete determine how hard they go. So I'm not particularly using zones per se, I'm just using this lactate threshold power, FTP, and lactate threshold heart rate to sense check how things are working. And I use historical performance to set the training sessions, the interval training sessions, has this athlete done 4 by 8 minutes at 300 watts before? And if they have, how easy was it based on my review of the heart rate data, like I've just said before. If it was too easy, I might increase it. If it was about right, I might keep it the same. So it's like a combination of all the information that's available. So this might seem quite vague, but training is quite vague. You know, sometimes you're tired because the life influences how tired you are. You're not a machine. So you have to be adaptable. You don't have to be bang on a certain power or a certain heart rate to make a change. You just need to be, you know, around about that and just consistently keep doing it. Anyway, hopefully that's not a load of waffle. I hope it makes sense. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.